What is going on? Hello, Miss Village. How are you? Happy quarantine. Yeah, you guys see the curls popping out. Anyway, so I am here. This is Aleron. I am here with the perfect margarita. If you've never seen it before, quite deceptive, amazing. We've got our first person here, which is awesome. Second person here, very cool. 6,000. I made that one up. Anyway, so yeah. So you guys, I think, know, if you guys have been following along, that there is a new series coming out. It is a novel of the labyrinth, but it is not in the land. It is called God's Eye. And it was a bit of a misnomer. This is actually going to be the prologue, because I know that those of you that made it to Mistfest, got to listen to the prologue, but nobody else did. So I'm going to do this, and then I may do chapter 1 again in a couple days. But I just wanted to touch base with you guys, say hello, say happy quarantine. Please keep social distancing, and we can make it through all this kind of stuff. So yeah, okay, well, I am going to get started. So a couple updates first. So yeah, Nick is already started on book 8. Because of viruses and him having to take care of people in the family, it slowed down a little bit. We're still hoping for April, early May. It's going to be awesome. And same thing for the release of God's Eye, and then the audio for God's Eye will be out a couple months after that. Working with a awesome new narrator that I think you guys are going to love. So yeah. All right, so I'm gonna get started. That's the plan. This is the new lid that we will be putting out. I think I'm gonna make this like a little bit more like metallic goldy and put like some cool stuff on the side. But there you go. All right, so without further ado, the prologue for God's Eye, Awakening. 617,827,007 breaths. That was the original measurement of Remy's life. At the time of his birth, the fates of the Skeen had determined exactly how much time he'd be allotted and what he would do with it. His would be a life of honorable achievement, of sadness, true, but of far more joy. Of children and warm hearths, and finally, a life well spent would be crowned with a dignified death. It was true that predicting the weave of the fate strings was harder on Earth than on any other world due to the chaos in every Earthling, but still, the predictions of fate could be relied upon. For even in a system of the greatest order, there's the possibility of chaos. And even in a world of pure chaos, order can be found. Put another way, fate had plans, but they all went foobar when a bolt of pure higher energy struck the world. The weird Skeen was torn asunder, and the 3 immortal sisters found their own fate to be at risk. In the days following the Forsaking, when the sky turned a roiling gray, some lived that should have died, and many, many more died that should have lived. Threads were cut short, and many new threads were woven into the story of the earth. No being, no matter how powerful, could predict the future of the planet and the fates of the billions that were now set free to float on the winds of change and chance. One such soul was now running for his life. Screams were filling the night around him, and the sour tang of vomit filled the air as well, and his own heart beat harder than ever before. Though neither he nor any being would know, he was also now gasping the final breaths of his tragically shortened life. 107 breaths remaining. Remy stood at the door of the bunker, looking out into the night. It had been a long run out of the city and then through the forest. Sweat was running down his face and plastering his shirt to his back. He didn't even notice. His heart was thudding hard enough to almost deafen him. That didn't capture his attention either. All he was thinking about was the dead and the living. 259 of them had fled the city. Every one of the hundreds of souls had agreed to run to the dubious safety of this old army bunker. Now, only 68 remained. 55 had already made it into the fortified structure that would hopefully be their new home and salvation. 12 more prayed to any deity that would listen while they tried to make it to the fortified door. Remy hung on the outside of that door, one hand braced against the frame, and he bellowed, "Run! They're coming, run!" 105 breaths remaining. The only answer that he got was a pained scream of a woman. She was an overweight suburban mom that had somehow managed to survive when so many others had died. You wouldn't have thought she'd know how to make it through these first days of hell come to earth, but she had a will to survive that had served her well. Within eyesight of safety, however, her story came to an end. A mutated cat, black with red claws, jumped out of the darkness. It was no mere house cat, instead possessing the size of a mountain lion. It easily bore her screaming figure to the ground. The two rolled in a violent struggle, and her red blood spattered in broad arcs. It gouged, bit, and clawed while she begged for mercy. When a group of people survived days of death and hopelessness, they could form bonds strong enough to last a lifetime. Her screams of help echoed through the night, but not one of the other 11 slowed down or even looked back. No matter what bonds they had formed, in this new world, no paltry connection of friendship could protect you when monsters prowled. Misplaced mercy would kill you just as quickly as a fang or a claw. They weren't men and women of the Western Confederation anymore. Nations, gender, race, none of that mattered. Idealism was only for fools, and fools were dead. Most of them had actually already died in the first few days of the monster attacks. None of that, no screams or pleas, could sway them anymore. They were all forsaken now. All that mattered was their survival. Instead of stopping or helping, they just hoped that her agonized screams would keep the monsters at bay, and they used it as motivation to run faster. All of their legs pumped like pistons. They could hear the yowling screeches of more monsters closing in. When given a choice between heeding the threatening roars of the monsters or the begging of the woman who was surely almost already dead, the answer was obvious. The most kind-hearted of the 11 just wished her a quick death. The more pragmatic of them hoped that she suffered as long as possible. Her suffering might keep some of the monsters busy. Remy watched the woman go down and saw the blood spatter on the moonlit ground. She was still fighting, frantically pushing at the partially insubstantial body of the shadow cat. Her efforts did nothing. The only reason she was still alive was because the monster hadn't gone for the kill yet. Mutated or not, it still had the personality of a cat. It was playing with its food. The dark skin on his face tightened as Remy's jaw clenched in anger. Still, he didn't leave the doorway. He knew the same thing that the remaining 11 runners did. She was already dead. Her body just hadn't caught up to the fact yet. Instead, he looked at the men and women he could still save, his eyes locked onto the man lagging the farthest behind. The guy was a father, and he was only slower because he had his little boy in his arms. Even at 50 paces, Remy could see the white of the man's fear-swollen eyes. 100 breaths remaining. Remy shouted at him to run faster, but it was obvious the man was at the end of his stamina. He was falling further behind with every step, every labored breath. Exhaustion was putting lie to the belief that his parents could do anything to save their children. The monsters crooned in excitement at seeing a weak member fall behind the herd. That sound deepened the man's fear into terror. Froth appeared at the corner of his lips, and his son sobbed into his chest. I can't look back. I can't let go. Those were the two thoughts on repeat of the man's head as he gripped his small son to his chest. Don't look back. Don't let go. Don't look back. Don't let go. Two shadow cats emerged from the darkness and leaped. Their combined weight easily bore him to the ground. One swipe of the red talons opened up 3 jagged wounds in his back. The man arched, and the father cried out in agony. In his pain-addled state, his grip loosened on his son. The second cat sank its teeth deep into the boy's shoulder. The 3-year-old cried out in pained fear. He screamed, "Daddy!" over and over. The cries didn't last long. The man howled, "No!" as the last member of his family was literally ripped from his arms. The remaining sight the father had simply showed another shadow cat clamping its jaws over his son's face before jerking its head side to side. The small body of his offspring twitched spasmodically after the neck snapped. After that, the child soiled his pants. The world of the Forsaken showed the full extent of its mercy, and that the father's throat was ripped out before he saw his son being eaten piece by bloody piece. As their blood spilled out over the grassy field, the last vestiges of their bloodline disappeared forever. 95 breaths remaining. Damn you, Remy thought. His fingers gripped the doorway so hard his knuckles turned white, but he still remained in the bunker. He'd done enough getting them there. He'd sacrificed enough getting them out of the city and through the forest. The truth was they were all forsaken, and the weak would die sooner or later. Instead of leaving his safety, he shouted again for them to run faster. His eyes flashed upward in a particular way. The HUD phased into existence, and he examined the 3 bars in the upper left corner. They were all the same length, and each were a different color, red, blue, and green. Everything had changed when that heads-up display, or interface as some people called it, had appeared in the vision of every person on Earth, even the children. It was the same moment that they were all notified that their world was now connected to the labyrinth, whatever that was. Since that time, people had come to accept that if they let their eyes unfocus, then they could pull up their own video game interface. It was insane, but it was true. They'd all figured that it could give them information. It could even make them stronger. And it was true that it came easier to some than others. Some even managed to use their interface to gain significant powers. Most of those have been ranks of what had been come to call the ABLE. It was what people had started calling the minority of human beings that had been granted an ability during the Forsaking. Remy was one of those precious few. His ability was only the 2nd rank, uncommon, far from the nearly superhero capabilities that others had gotten. Still, it had let him teach some of the others to develop their own skills, attacks, and defenses. Being able had played no small part in making him the de facto member of his group. That thought seemed like a cruel joke now. What kind of leader lost nearly 80% of his people? As dark figures continued to materialize out of the night, the survivors sprinted for their own lives. A teenage boy was the next to fall. His screams were blood-curdling as 2 of the cat monsters bore him to the ground. The shrieks only grew in pitch and volume as he was dragged off into the night. The next to go was a father who chose to spend his life to save his family. He knew it was about to happen, but he still brought his wife and daughter precious seconds. His daughter reached out one small hand backward and screamed his name, but her mother held on to her squirming body and sprinted for the safety of the bunker door. The father had been holding a nail-studded bat, and it started to glow red for just a moment as he activated his skill, Sweeping Blow. The weapon moved almost on its own. The speed it cut through the air was far faster than the man should have been able to manage on his own. More, it struck not 1 but 3 of the cat monsters all at once. The trio of the monsters were knocked backward, rolling along the ground. The special attack had not come without a price, though. The man's stamina had already been running low, and his special attack bottomed it out. The father fell to his hands and knees, gasping. Another cat approached him cautiously. It sniffed and circled half of his body to see if he would attack again. The man glared at it, but he couldn't do any more but heave labored breaths. Seconds later, it sprung onto his back and sank its fangs into his neck. More blood gushed from the wound. A strangled groan came out, and the man collapsed to the ground. Remy couldn't even remember his name. Seconds later, 4 more cats had latched on, eating him alive as his life ebbed away. In the last seconds, the brave man lost all semblance of courage. His cries filled the air, and he screamed for his own mother as he pissed himself. 81 breaths remaining. Remy just couldn't stand it any longer. The pleading eyes of the mother, holding her daughter, who had seen her own father die, finally broke him. It was true that he'd left men and women to die before. Making difficult decisions did not weigh him down like it did so many others. But that didn't mean he had no heart, contrary to what many people thought. Instead, it just meant that his heart was harder and rougher than others, that he was willing to bear pains that others weren't. Still, 2 things drove him away from the safety of the shelter. 1, maybe he could help some of them. At the very least, he could improve their chances. He learned long ago that pain was a lesser burden than regret. Remington had sworn to help these people. He would try to fulfill that promise if he could, even if it meant risking his own life. The second reason was far more logical. He hadn't made it through these last days unscathed. A bite from a small mutated insect, something that had just looked like a small flying scorpion, had done more damage than any monster he'd run into. That thought brought a grim humor during the last days of flight. For a man that had climbed over the bodies of his own comrades, that had literally washed his face in blood, It was going to be a bug that was going to kill him. In the past few days, the bite had grown from a small red nodule to a golf ball-sized hole in his side. The edges were black and necrotic. Tendrils of infection spread out from the wound, reaching up into his chest and across his stomach. He had held some hope that the bunker might have antibiotics, but in this last day, he'd known that no small shot of penicillin was going to kill whatever organism was eating him alive. It was better to make his last days count for something. Gripping his rifle, he took a step out of the bunker. Before he could go further, though, a hand gripped his coat sleeve. Looking back, he met his sister's eyes. "No." She spoke the word in a tone that was half command, half begging. The pleading intensity was reflected in her fevered eyes. Her face was wan from blood loss and fever. She'd lost 3 fingers in an attack 5 days ago. Now the entire limb was fire engine red with infection and the stumps were black. She didn't say anything else, but the plea in her rheumy eyes was obvious. "Don't leave me," they said. "For once. Don't try to be the hero. Don't risk your life. Just let them die." The look in his own eyes was all the answer she needed. There was love, apology, and a steely resolve. Maybe if he was the hero that she thought he was, he would have stayed. What she did not know was he had killed more people than any of these horrible monsters. He'd sent countless more to their deaths. Again and again, he'd made the difficult choices that other men and women of conscience would balk at. That was why the government had always called him. He was the one that would always look at the bigger picture and just wash the blood from his hands when he was done. But now, there was no bigger picture. There was just a child that he could help. And if it cost him his life, that was a deal he was willing to make. Seeing the steel in his eyes, his sister let him go, tears already beginning to fall. He didn't waste time or breath on more words. Instead, he stepped away out of the bunker and raised the rifle to his shoulder. Focusing, he poured his will into the weapon and brought the stock up to his cheek. A now familiar overlay appeared in his vision as he accessed his sure shot skill. Reticles appeared over every enemy in his view and greatly increased his accuracy. With the second exertion of will, each bullet on the rifle was infused with a gold-white light. He had no idea how it worked, but thanks to his ability, he could pour mana into each bullet. It made the shots hit harder. That was necessary because the monster's invaders seemed to be able to shrug off bullets in an unnatural way. In the past few days, Remy had had plenty of time to shake his head at the insanity of these new quote-unquote natural laws. All he cared about in that moment, though, was that he could bring the pain. Doing all of this took scant seconds after leaving the bunker. Despite that, it represented a major portion of the life he had left. 69 breaths remaining. After triggering Ammo of Light, his mana plummeted by more than half. It gave him a headache, but Remy pushed it aside. His focus was devoted to the enemy and the innocents he was trying to save. The former soldier sighted through his scope and squeezed, never pulled the trigger. 3 rounds shot from the end of the barrel in a second. Each tore through the air, trailing white light behind them, and exploded into the body of one of the cats. 50 yards away, the bullets entered the monster, the kinetic damage amplified by his use of light energy. He didn't know it, but the cat was at least partially a dark creature. The opposing nature of his attack greatly magnified the damage. 3 grievous wounds appeared in its body and it fell down dead. Remy had already sighted on another, and 3 more white tracers filled the night. With his increased accuracy and damage, the closest members of the pack were soon dispatched, giving his people precious seconds. Even as he replaced the clip in his AR-15, his breath came in heavy gasps. Sure Shot increased the likelihood that he hit his target, something absolutely necessary with the agile cats, but it drained his stamina every second he used it. His mana was also almost bottomed out. The magic depletion brought a splitting headache with it that made it harder to think. When he fired again, the bullets didn't have the white tracing of magic and did considerably less damage. But that didn't matter to Remy. He just kept firing. 57 breaths remaining. Under his cover, the survivors made it to the bunker, including the mother and her child. When the last living member of the group finally passed him, hope surged in his breast. It was another suburban mom. This one was wearing a ripped and filthy designer tracksuit. At some point, the rhinestones on her bottom had probably spelled pink, but now it just said N. He couldn't even muster the energy to laugh. Evelyn had clearly been a Buckhead beauty, Betty, one of those trophy wives that had been down at Publix and only shopped at Whole Foods and the farmer's market. Now, though, her cheeks were sunken in and her face was gaunt from weeks of near starvation. Sweat drenched her body and made her face shine in the light. She looked him in the eye as she passed, her gaze filled with both fear and gratitude. Remy just nodded to her before sighting back on the cats that were coming closer. "Keep going," he shouted at her while he started backing up. "I'll hold them back." "Thank you," she cried. It was more of a sobbing gasp than pronounced words, but she did as she was told. Remy kept firing as he moved back. His eyes were on a swivel, trying to keep track of the shadowy bodies of the predator cats. The monsters had slowed to an aggressive stalk. They all glared at him malevolently, but didn't rush forward. He kept his gun raised, but didn't fire in turn. The truth was, this was his last clip. Remy had managed to kill more than 10 of the monsters, but they had just stepped over their fallen without a glance. The man pointed his gun at one of them, then the other, hoping they were smart enough to be afraid, but not so intelligent to know that his stamina and mana were almost at 0. 39 breaths remaining. For a moment, he allowed himself to think that everything would be okay, that his foolish gamble would pay off and he would make it back to the safety of the bunker, having saved some lives. But that was when he heard the scream. Risking a look behind him, he saw that the woman that had just passed him, the one that he had risked his life to protect, was lying in a pool of her own blood. 2 cats had circled around and caught her before she could make it to the safety of the doorway. He looked past the duo, now feasting on the woman's flesh, and saw more shadow cats running towards the entrance of the fortified structure that was only 30 yards away. Remy looked past Evelyn's mutilated body and locked eyes with his older sister. She was still standing in the doorway, her one good hand on the knob. She silently begged him to somehow run faster than the bounding cats, to somehow make it back to safety and not to leave her. He gave her the smallest shake of his head, and his face communicated a simple request. Close the door. 22 breaths remaining. Her heart broke, but they had both been raised by the same strong woman. Neither was afraid to face the truth, and neither shied from difficult tasks. With a fractured cry, she slammed the heavy door shut and threw the bolt just in time. One of the shadow cats slammed into it so hard that it fractured its spinal column. The impact made a bone-cracking crunch. Other monstrous cats immediately began scratching at the wood. Their claws gouged deep furrows in the door, but it was only the outer door that was made of oak. The inner was solid metal. She closed that as well and locked it seconds after the first. The only light was the faint red from the hazard bulbs. In the near darkness, she stared at the chrome metal door as if trying to see through it, trying to let her brother know that he wasn't alone, even though he was. A low-pitched growl made Remy snap his head forward again. He'd only looked away for a couple seconds, but some of the cats stalking him had covered more than half the distance between them and him. They weren't slowing down. After having been on so many battlefields, he knew what was about to happen. He played chicken with death more times than he could count, but this time, something inside of him confirmed there would be no escape. At the end of his journey, as the cats raced towards him, he had a slight bit of shock as he realized that in addition to adrenaline, pain, and a wisp of fear, what he was really feeling was free. Soon he wouldn't have to worry about saving anyone, about being a good person, about denying what he was, about keeping the monster inside of himself at bay. His entire life he'd struggled against the violence and anger that always seemed right below the surface. He joined the military to channel his impulses. He'd been recruited by the organization to release them. He'd been told that the blood he'd spilled and the lies he'd sacrificed were all for the greater good. He'd even escaped death after leaving the service, gone into medicine to balance out the cosmic debt, though truth be told, it was more to humor his mother than anything else. Even in the hospital, though, he couldn't run from what he was. He'd been drawn to blood and trauma, once again making dispassionate decisions with life and death. All of that to try to honor his upbringing and not let that part of him run free. But now, in these last seconds, he could just be what he was. There wasn't much time left, but with the time that he did have, he was going to share his pain. There was a smile on his face as he squeezed the trigger once more. Cats fell, but many more kept running towards him. He guessed Uncle Yo was right, he thought with a grin. Pussy really will be the death of me. He squeezed the trigger and pumped more rounds into the circling shadow cats. He pulled the trigger until he heard the noise he'd been dreading. Click, click, click. The rifle was empty. The pack seemed to know he was no longer a threat. They slowed down again and began to creep forward like an unstoppable black tide. The cats didn't have the intelligence of a human, but they understood pain. They understood suffering, and they loved them both. At the end of their prey's life, they followed the instincts of their evil hearts and savored the hopelessness of the bleeding man before him. After all, surrounded and alone in the dark, what could he possibly do? Hearing their yowls and soft screeches, Remington didn't feel fear. He felt anger. He'd been through too many battles to delude himself. He knew these were his last seconds, but that didn't bother him. He'd spent his life well. And as far as he was concerned, the people that he'd saved with his own life, well, that was a pretty good deal. What pissed him off was that he could feel the arrogance and dismissal of these beasts. What could he do? With a grin on his face, he said, I can do anything. He reached one hand over the diseased wound in his side and dug his fingers in. The feeling almost made him want to puke, but he was able to pull out a congealed mass of blood and pus. It cost him a few health points, but that wouldn't matter very soon. He reached down to his own waist for the hatchet he'd taken from a hardware store, and he liberally speared his own filth along the blade of the weapon. It wouldn't kill any of the monsters before he died, but maybe, just maybe, he'd pull a few more of these bastards into the abyss with him after he was gone. Well, he shouted as loud as his weakened body would allow, let's finish this. The monsters couldn't understand him, but they agreed to his terms all the same. The rest of the pack sprang forward almost like a shadowy black wave. Angry yowls filled the air. He swung his weapon and scored a deep cut against the face of one of the cats. It was knocked to the ground, and he was already swinging at another. This time, his axe bit into a monster's shoulder. It stopped the monster's pounce, but his weapon was caught for a precious second in its flesh. In that time, another jumped on him from another side, raking its dark magic-enhanced claws down his body. Remy cried out as more blood began to flow. 14 breaths remaining. Turning awkwardly, he chopped at the head of the cat that had sunk its teeth into him. It growled deeply but didn't let go. He pulled his arm back to swing again, but a second cat pounced before the strike could land. It caught his right wrist in a bite that fractured his bones. Remy screamed beside himself and fell to one knee. Before he could do anything more, a third monster dove onto his back. He collapsed to the ground. After that, all he knew was pain, the heavy stink of his own blood, and the lust-frenzied cry to the monsters that were eating him. 3 breaths remaining. 2 breaths remaining. 1 breath remaining. A final bolded prompt appeared in his vision, heavy with finality. You have died. So, that was the prologue. I'm sorry, you got me sweating over here. That was the prologue for God's Eye. I don't know if you can tell, it's a slightly darker turn than The Land. We're going to be looking at how the labyrinth is connecting many worlds. And also, if you guys were ever wondering, what happened to that last bolts of chaos magic after he claimed the Bloodstone. So, I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you are looking forward to it. It is going to be a new epic series. I've plotted out mini books for it already, and I'm just doing the final edits on this one before I get it over my betas, and then we're going to get it out to you guys, and that's the plan. So, I hope that you guys are staying safe in quarantine. I hope that you are not being, pushed down by the gravity and the craziness, all of this. We will get through this together. I appreciate the Mist Village so very much. You guys make this all happen. And, that's the plan. So, look forward to God's Eye. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And as always, peace, love, and the perfect margarita.